Hello, I am Eric Banks, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the 2020 Brooklyn Book Festival. We're here today with authors Romesh Gunesekera, Ivan Vladislavic, and Suneeta da Costa. Before we begin, I want to let you know that books by the authors in this program can be purchased in the link below. Now, I'd like to introduce our authors very briefly. Romesh Gunesekera is the author of Monkfish Moon, Reef, which was shortlisted for the Booker Prize, The Sandglass, The Match, Noontide Toll, and most recently, Suncatcher. Elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature in 2004, he grew up in Sri Lanka and now lives in London. Ivan Vladislavic was born in Pretoria in 1957 and lives in Johannesburg. His books include the novels The Restless Supermarket, The Exploded View, Double Negative, and most recently, The Distance. He published Portrait with Keys, a sequence of documentary texts on Johannesburg in 2006. He has also edited books on art and architecture. TJ Double Negative, a project with photographer David Goldblatt, received the 2011 Krasner-Krautz Award for Best Photography book. His work has won the Sunday Times Fiction Prize, the Alan Paton Award, the University of Johannesburg Prize, and a 2015 Wyndham Campbell Prize for Fiction. Suneeta da Costa is an Australian author of Goan origin. She writes fiction and nonfiction, plays and poetry. Her latest book, Saudade, which is published by Transit and USA and Canada last year, 2019, concerns the legacies of Portuguese colonialism and the Goan diaspora in Angola. It was shortlisted for the 2019 Australian Prime Minister's Literary Awards, the 2020 Adelaide Festival Awards for Literature, and a finalist in Field Notes 2020 Tournament of Books. She has written for the Sydney Review of Books, Meanjin, and Peril, and has worked as an editor, critic, and teacher for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, the National Gallery of Victoria, and the University of Technology Sydney, among other organizations. So, welcome you all this morning. It's very good to see you by Zoom and intercontinentally and from across the world. Coming of age stories have been some of the most celebrated recent novels in the United States have dealt with coming of age themes in difficult and challenging and changing times. In the past year, Colson Whitehead's book Nickel Boys, for example, revisited this great genre in literature. The Topeka School by Ben Lerner also revisited the author's late childhood in Kansas. It's an eternal theme that writers revisit and reinvent and use to develop perspectives on other times, and particularly the times of their own childhood. Graham Greene once wrote, "There is always a moment in childhood when the door opens and lets the future in," which is a very forward-facing view of what we think about as coming-of-age stories. So your books actually examine the recent past, and in some cases, a past that's recent but is quite far away, but also speaks to our current moment. I'd like to begin, if I may, by asking our panelists just to give us a flavor of their recent books and to read to us just briefly from their publications. And I'd like to ask Sunita if she would consider beginning with her new book, Saudade.
I'm going to read from the beginning of Saudade, and I hope that will give you a picture of my novella. My mother told me that the dead walk backward. She said they try to walk forward but can only walk backward. When she told me that, I was sitting on the step that led from the kitchen to the compound, my hand cupped on her kneecap. A draft of shadows from the pink guava tree splayed on the concrete when the sunlight pierced the clouds overhead. That was our first house, the one in which I was born in Benguela, and I can still see it in my mind's eye, close and shimmering like a still life, although it probably has, like so much else, now gone. She had asked Caetano to fetch a papaya for our breakfast, and while we waited for him, we watched the guinea cock that my father had brought home as a gift from a client in Uige. It did not crow, did not make a sound, only silently circled the compound, opening and shutting the tiny aperture of its beak, pecking uselessly for seed.
When I clapped my hands, it did not scamper in fright, only bristled its red comb and lifted its tired wings. My mother said that if I dreamt of someone with their feet about facing, I should be sure to wake myself up, because the nearer they seemed, the further they would have led me to their world, the world of the dead. I turned to face her. It was just then my favourite occupation simply to watch her. Her beautiful eyes, outlined with kohl, grew large and small, accentuating by turns part of what she said, now that. It was the middle of the dry season, but each time her lips parted, I found myself in an oasis in which I wanted for nothing. I had no need to look at the horizon, but if I did, it would have gone on and on, a hungerlessness that might well be called paradise. The wind was blowing from the coast, a salt wind from the Atlantic, which I would feel against me as a phantom presence, even when it was not there anymore. The sun was not shining, and its not shining was neither here nor there. I was not waiting for the sun to reveal itself to me. Although I was old enough, 3 years old, perhaps 4, I seldom spoke at this time. No one really remarked on this fact, nor how I hung off every one of my mother's words. Indeed, I could have continued in this same vein for an eon or more, unaware of the peril of what might lie ahead. That her words could come to have a dangerous sway over me, that they might make me look this way and that, only in vain, only to be met by a darkness which was also unnameable, I could not have conceived, for I was more contented by the fact of her voice than what she had to say. At that time, there were so many things I did not know. My mind and body were like a tabula rasa, on which much would be written, even if later I might want it all to be erased too. She said that brushas, being consorts of the dead, have twisted feet. Soon Caetano returned. He was carrying the papaya under one arm and a tin of honey in his other hand. It was quite a balancing act, and yet he was able to secure the papaya under his arm as though it was second nature to him. Caetano wore an old pair of my father's shoes. They were a little too big, and so it seemed he might trip over at any moment. That morning, Papa had joked that if Caetano were to die, we would have to bury him in these shoes. My father had made this quip in Konkani. When he was angry or trying to be funny, Papa spoke in Konkani. I did not yet know that Konkani was a tongue that might have belonged to a people from whom I was also descended, to a place and time of which I nevertheless had no memory, and so it was neither discordant nor alluring to my ear. My mother moved fluently between Portuguese and Konkani, and the tone she used with me or my father, no different than that she used to speak to Efigenia and Caetano. She took the tin when Caetano held it out to her, winked and said, "At this rate we could go into business." She turned the few honeycombs that lay at the bottom of the tin toward the light and said, "What do you say, Caetano?" Caetano smiled uneasily, shrugged and made to brush something away from his face. His face in that light was a copper colour. His father was a Dane who had settled on a coffee plantation in Mozambique, only to return to Copenhagen when he had grown tired of the East African plains. His mother, a native of Cabo Delgado, had died when he was small, so he had been brought up in a Lorenzo Marquez orphanage. Now, when his hair fell over his eyes, my mother said he ought to get a haircut. "Yes, Mummy," Caetano answered, swatting an invisible fly before his face. It was curious to hear him call her Mummy. He was still a child when he had come to my parents some years before I was born, and now he might have been 13 or 14 and full of a wary self-consciousness. When he shifted his weight from one foot to another, my mother sighed and passed the papaya into my own small arms. Its skin was green-speckled black. It felt cool and heavy, and I wondered what would happen if it fell, what sound it would make when it hit the ground, whether it would split or roll away. I'll just stop there.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. Can you say something before before I turn to other panelists? Can you say something about the title of the book, which may not? I put an extra syllable on the end, but Saudade. What can you tell us what that word means in this context?
Yeah, sure, Eric. It's Saudade is a Portuguese word, and obviously this book is concerned with the Luso-African Goan experience. So saudade in Portuguese means the equivalent of longing for lost things, although it's said that it's an untranslatable word
these sorts of words that exist in languages where we don't have an equivalent in another language. It's associated a lot with, well, historically they think it arose from the time of the discoveries when Portuguese sailors were missing their homes when they went, you know, discovering other parts of the world, and they were far away from Portugal. And I guess I've kind of reinscribed it in Saudade, in this novella, to capture the sense of the colonized peoples who, after the Portuguese presence, what their fates were and their sense of longing and loss, and to take into account not just that early experience of nostalgic Saudade, which in Portugal is also associated with fado music and folklore and things like that, but to take in this colonial, the dissonance of the colonized experience and history of slavery that was part of the Portuguese Empire. So yeah, just briefly, that's where.
Yeah, it works on many different levels in your book. Thank you, Romesh. May I ask you to read from your new novel, Suncatcher, please?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. So I read from that, for those of you who can see that. I'll read from the beginning, like Sunita did, slightly edited version so that I can fit it into 5 minutes exactly. So I'm not going to introduce it very much. It tells everything as we go. I first met Jay in a church car park off the high road, midway as the crow flies between the mosque and the temple, one June afternoon in 1964. Two boys on the brink of a bond that would alter the course of our lives, neither knowing which one would blink first or fall furthest, nor the cost of finding out. He rode in hands on hips, freewheeling on the dusty tarmac, using only his weight to steer his bike as he leant from side to side. Blue stripy feathers and rawhide tied to the upside-down handlebars twirled in the hot, sticky air. The sun-baked streaks on his proud boyish cheeks shone. Want a race? He lobbed the challenge. I wheeled around. Where? The Scarp, Torrington. Jay stretched his long, slender neck, more like a swan than an eagle, strands of damp hair playing across his open face. Been down that? From the beginning, I lied. Although it might have been the steepest slope in my part of town, I didn't see why that should be a problem if it didn't bother him. My only misgiving was the rivalry I felt rising in my chest. Jay spun his pedals backwards. A big Bowie knife, a real one with antler handle, leered from his belt. Scary, huh? His lips opened wider, revealing a crescent of awkward adolescent teeth. Nah, the word came out wrong, stretched and warbled instead of strong and defiant. Jay was taller, probably older by a couple of years. Neither of us could tell exactly by how much. But that did not discourage us from circling closer and finding a nervous delight in the novelty of each other. For days, I'd been worried by the idea that the more you savor something, the sooner it might disappear. But I said nothing more. He dismounted and pinned a tightly folded piece of flutter paper to the rear strut of his bike. He strummed the spokes. I needed a guide, a hero, illumination. Jay, I now know, needed an acolyte. At the turnoff, where the big tamarind trees brooded, he stopped and waited for me to catch up. Pedal hard! Even if you think you're hurtling, streamline everything. He blew at his loose hair with an upward puff. Hurtling, like scarp, another word no other schoolboy I knew would use. I tightened my hands on the rubber grips. He must have guessed I hadn't zoomed down the hill before, but didn't seem to care that I'd pretended. Right. 1, 2, 3, go! A fraction of a second behind Jay, whose silver bike did hurtle, I bent low, gripping hard, and flew. The grey cemetery wall, stray bougainvillea, and mimosa melted into a thin blur. We whizzed past two sun-dipped women collecting water from a standpipe, tires spraying sparklets, thumbs jabbing tinkle-tankle, flooding the valley with peals of laughter. Then the road reared up, everything slowed. "Come on," Jay yelled, "pedal harder." Even standing on the pedals wasn't enough. I ground to a stop and had to push my bike. A shame that my muscles proved to be the dead loss I always suspected them to be. Too much, huh? Couldn't do it. The last bit. He didn't mock me. "Let's go for a chocolate." He whipped down a small stony lane. I followed, sticking to the smooth edge. The house on the corner had a garden of pink and purple, a hideout for rustlers and outlaws from the ordinary world in which I too did not belong. I yearned for adventure, far from my ma and pa, even though I loved them, if love was what I believed it was, and had nothing to do with girls and boys. When we reached the main road, Jay accelerated to top speed again, riding the wave in the flabby ribbon of tar that had softened and swollen in the lazy afternoon sun. Halfway along, a new milk bar, the first of its kind in Colombo, where I had read in a Sunday ad you could get the flavor of the future, chocolate, vanilla, even tangolac. Jay, sidling up to the zinc counter, asked the man behind it for a chocolate milk, then turned to me. "So, what do you want?" Confused, I plumped for the same. "Yeah, me too." Something moved inside me. Something mysteriously more that I longed for, but could not yet put into words. I could wait. Most of my time was spent waiting. Waiting to grow up. Waiting for childhood's demons to die. Waiting for my life to start. Waiting for someone like Jay to turn up and switch on the lights.
Thank you. You plunge us immediately into that relationship that will define the contours of the book between Cairo and Jay. That very intense friendship, which is also filled with mysterious connections and mysterious longings, and this sense of that we have to ask ourselves in the very beginning about what is really in it for each character. What is this mysterious pole of attraction? So thank you. That's a wonderful introduction to Suncatcher. Now, Yvonne, if you would also would read to us from the distance, I would be grateful.
So I'm reading from the distance. It's a story told by two brothers, and I think that the section I'm going to read, I think might be quite compatible with Romesh's piece. I was planning to read something else, but I think I'll read this. It comes from about a third of the way into the book, and it's the elder brothers speaking. "My brother wants me to tell his story, or is it mine, ours? Can a story ever belong equally to two people? Perhaps I need to answer this question before I can ask another. Where do I start? I'm hunched over my manuscript book at the kitchen counter, pressing down on it, as if I'd like to submerge it in the granite. Nothing comes. I should try writing on my laptop, like a modern-day author, but I can't get my brother out of my bones. He's occupied my body. He's squatting in my muscles. So I just sit there, wrist cocked, pencil poised, ear turned downward to the page. The manuscript book is the family standby. But what kind of pencil does he prefer? Most of the scribblings he's shown me are in crumbly graphite. A Staedtler 2B, or could it be a propelling pencil? It's years since I saw him write anything down. He has a phobia about writing in public, thinks it's unseemly and unlucky. He doesn't have that problem with reading, and I can picture him doing it. The posture is easy to mimic. I slump down on the stool with my head hanging. What would the book be? The Saint meets his match. There isn't a Simon Templar book in the house, I know this for a fact, but I get up and browse along the shelves in the lounge as if there might be. Most of the books are Rita's. Her tastes were always better than mine. The blokes on the bottom shelf, Goodis, Chandler, Hammett, that's me. Joe outgrew this crew and never thought much of my reading habits, which makes it even weirder that he wants me in his book. unless he thinks my vulgar tastes will add a layer of authentic detail to a book about his youth, a portrait of the artist as his ill-bred brother. Perhaps I'll stop there.
That's great. It also brings up so many themes that I think that that all of you share in your books, and that will be curious to talk to you about. I think all of these books explore characters who are intense readers. They have a very strong relationship to not only to reading in general, but to a really specific syllabus, which I think is fascinating to compare your books in those ways. And many of the reading selections are very much guided by the moment that you're visiting. They're very redolent of a particular period that a young man in Pretoria, a young woman in Angola, a young man in what would become Sri Lanka, but at the time was colonial Ceylon, would be exposed to. There are also really very personal flavors as well, which I think is also quite interesting. And I think in the case of The Distance, of course, there's the massive and fascinating exploration of what the particular patois of writing about boxing sounded like in 1971 to about I guess to the mid 70s. I think that's a fascinating sort of thread that all of you share. It's also all of your characters have to at some point or another explore what it means to write, and they're clearly thinking about what it will mean to become writers. In Sunita's case, there's that wonderful passage toward the end of your book where the character is praised by a boyfriend for the qualities of her writing, and she resists in a certain way and says to be a writer is in a sense to be cut off from the rest of the world. You have to be alone, and you're not a person, a character in the world. Those are a few things that I hope we'll be able to talk about in the limited time that we have. But I just want to start by asking you, all three of you, how you sort of came to this particular book. You're writing these are not just obviously stories of coming of age stories. They're really stories that novels that take us very deep into very specific histories, and they're all histories at a moment when the worlds that they explore are changing massively and rapidly. They're, I think, in all three cases, moments either when these particular societies are coming to reckon with the colonial past, or they're emerging into the kind of modern global entertainment world of spectacle in the case of The Distance. So I wonder if you would tell us just a little bit about how you found your way into this topic. Did you start with one book and it ended up being a different kind of coming of age story? Did you want to explore particular resonance of childhood, and it opened up a different kind of world? What's the tail and what's the head of the story? What's leading what as you begin to work on these books? So I'd throw that open to all of you.
But while we're thinking about that, can I just say, in terms of the connections, I loved Ivan, the saint being in there, because the saint makes his appearance in a bookshop that my characters go into as well. And
There's
I also
love in a lot of James Bond, I think, that appears.
It's all those same books that were traveling around the world at that time before literary festivals started moving things around. But I also love the connection with the Sunita's title and these untranslatable words, though in fact there's a very similar word that the Welsh have, which is herath, I think, which means, again, this sense of, which isn't quite nostalgia, but it's a sense of yearning for a kind of place that's in your head, I guess, more than anywhere else. And I thought that's really, really interesting, the way these things sort of connect us together. But I'll let somebody else start on the tail and the tail, as it were.
Well, shall I say something?
Yes.
I mean, my novel is really made possible by a collection of news clippings, of news cuttings about Muhammad Ali, which I kept as a young teenager. I think without that collection, it would have been impossible to write the book. And the book really arose from me grappling over many years with these cuttings and wanting to write something about them, and producing over a 20-year period, producing things which were sort of like little essays which dealt with different aspects of the language and different aspects with the imagery, and with trying to deal with the politics that were revealed in the cuttings and so on, but was never able to make a satisfying text of it. And at some point, all of that work almost began to demand, as texts sometimes do, it began to demand a different element. And that element was really something about my boyhood. It felt like I had to somehow embed this commentary about the cuttings and about boxing and about the hero worshipping of Ali in a childhood story. And so the one kind of writing called the other kind of writing into existence, and and they then became two characters. Mm-hmm. So the one character is the writer character who's trying to deal with this material, and he calls on his brother to try and help him reconstruct their childhood. So when you ask, is it the book I thought I was writing? No, it was at least 5 different books before it arrived at this point. And I think that the slowness of it is kind of partly why the book turned out the way it did. I think if you asked earlier about why I write this now, yeah. I think somehow all the wrestling over a long period with trying to find a form for the text finally issued in something that feels kind of satisfactory.
What was when you say it was a long time? I mean, how long did you think about? How long were you revisiting these notebooks that you assembled or scrapbooks that you assembled as a young person?
The first notes about it go back to about 20 years. Okay. And then I did it in bursts. Every 5 years, I'd get it into my head that I was now ready to deal with this, and then start writing on it, and then stop. And I'm sure my colleagues have that same experience, that sometimes something just won't be written mm-hmm. until all the kind of elements are aligned, and then somehow it becomes possible.
Yeah. Sunita, can I bring you into the conversation? Is this how did your novel come together with these? I hate to say that these are sort of twin poles, because they're not. I mean, but how did you come to write this particular coming of age story? How did you find your character as a way to think about the colonialism in Angola?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting for me. My novel too, novella, evolved over a long period. I was actually living in the United States at the time I began writing it, quite some years ago, and race was a big preoccupation at that time. But my first novel had come out shortly before that, and that's also a coming of age, if you like, novel. But I really think, looking back, when I think about the process of recasting Saudade, because I did redraft, and it came out many years later in a different incarnation. This novella form. It was short. It's much briefer, highly poetic language, and so on. I do think that I was. Well, one thing was that in Homework, my first novel, I treated the experience of British colonialism in Australia and the legacy of dispossession of Indigenous people and the migration experience of, say, a Goan family to the suburbs in the 80s of Sydney. And so I was curious about, from a personal point of view, my ancestry, the legacy of the Portuguese aspect of my ancestry. I actually am a
Portuguese national as well. I happen to be, but I was born in Australia and have grown up here. And I think there were themes, shadows of the things I was exploring about my Australian identity that almost were more, I wanted to think about what would have happened had my family migrated in an earlier generation to a different part of the world. I did have family members on my father's side who did go to Angola and then left, like the Maria's family and Saudade when independence came. But also at a psychological level, I think Saudade is very much about attachment. And I remember being quite obsessed at the time with theories of attachment and language, psychology of language in childhood, in children, and acquisition of language, and the idea of trauma and what happens when people are displaced and what happens to language then. So there's this eruption, I guess, of languages in that book. And the very fact that I'm sort of engaging, although it's written in English, with this almost purely Lusophone world, is probably a kind of exploration of what happens with Maria's sense of identity, even in terms of where she belongs linguistically and culturally. Yeah, so I guess I was interested in attachment and what happens when there are cultural ruptures in that experience of a child, a girl particularly, you know, because the female experience is paramount in Saudade. What happens to her sense of identity when there are these ruptures? So there's a colonial, you know, experience, and then this sense of disintegration of the world she's grown up in, and all these sort of double yokes of colonialism going on. Like India was occupied by Portugal, and then from the time she's actually born, 1961, in Angola, India has actually been, Goa has been, did I say India? I mean, Goa was part of Portugal until 1961. And then from 1961, which is when Saudade starts and when the independence struggle in Angola actually started, Goa was taken over by India. So there are these manifold like aspects of awareness of her genealogy and history. So I think these are all things that I wanted to explore in the process of an older narrator who is looking back on her childhood with this kind of acute consciousness of moments that she came into some sort of political awareness, or was part of why the Bildungsroman structure appealed and remained long after I, you know, restructured it and published it when it came to being published. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry for the long-winded answer.
No, not at all. Not at all. Yeah, it's and I remember the same question. Part of what you know, I find that it's always interesting to think about how novels come to be written, how they come together, and the kinds of adjustments you make. And then, of course, people are always interested to the extent that something may be a roman à clef, etc. So I, you know, ask you the same question.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess the thing about writing novels to me, I guess, is to take the metaphor from the Suncatcher. It's a bit like trying to catch the sun. You know, it's a kind of almost a doomed mission. You're trying to get there, and you run around all over the place for it. In this case, this book, I think, is a book I've been wanting to write probably from the very, very beginning when I started writing. I just, like Ivan was saying, I just didn't know how to do it, how to deal with this. What I wanted, I think, was to deal with this sense of briefness and loss in terms of friendship and early friendship. And I just didn't, you know, it was there. It's probably what has prompted me to write right from the beginning, even almost as a kid, you know, right in the middle of it, as it were. This sense of time passing, of things changing, and particularly what seemed to me very fragile relationships that just can break so easily for so many different reasons. And I think I've written poems kind of related to perhaps this story, or maybe a couple of short stories, but I really didn't know, and I'm beginning to understand perhaps that part of it is to do with how we negotiate between what we remember and what we imagine. So it's a negotiation between memory and imagination for me. And I wasn't in a place to be able to do that with this particular story or this material, if you like, until about, where are we now, 2020, I suppose. I really started thinking about this story and beginning to shape it probably almost 10 years ago. But I didn't really start putting pencil to paper or keyboard to screen or whatever it is, a bit like your character Ivan, who's trying to work out how to put those words on paper. That didn't happen until about 2013, something like that, 14. And it became possible partly because I wanted to visit this period, the 60s, for a lot of different reasons, most pressingly because of the last book I wrote. The last book I wrote was a book called Noontide Toll, which is set in the immediate aftermath of the end of the war in Sri Lanka, this terrible long war that went on for practically 30 years, came to an end in 2009, a very problematic, bloody end. And I wrote a book that was set in the immediate aftermath and, in a sense, dealing with, as Sunita says, trauma, I suppose, and how that affects people. And so with the next book, I wanted to, in a sense, go back to a period before any of that happened, before that 30-year war, and to see what the world was like then. And the reason I think of it in terms of negotiating memory and imagination is because that period, though I can remember it, I can't remember it perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the people who could remember it are no longer around.
Yeah.
You know, they've passed away, friends have passed away. And so I found that in a way, the fact that I had to use my imagination as well, very liberating and enabled me to enter the story, which I thought, to go back to your question, what sort of a story was it? I thought it would be a story about the awakening of friendship. But it became much more a story of awakening of all sorts of things, including a kind of political awakening for a young boy. Mm-hmm. Probably an awakening that I didn't have at that age, that took me perhaps a couple of decades longer to have, but I could see it happening. And this is a boy who begins to see kind of, because his Cairo comes from I wouldn't say an ordinary background, but a more ordinary background. It's not ordinary because his father is very political. He's an armchair Marxist, if you like, Trotskyite, in fact. But his friend Jay comes from a very wealthy class, a very privileged class. And I suppose this is partly what he begins to see, the price of that privilege.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the stark differences between the characters and the worlds that they come from is very much part of the novel, and it has interesting connections to Sunita's book in that regard as well. Of course, the characters her character comes from a family that is in a colonial. Practically colonial administrators, not exactly, but they're sort of connected much more to protecting colonial interests than they are to thinking about other things. I like the way that you also frame that about the negotiation of memory and imagination. In the distance, this Ali archive, you actually have this very material archival presence, sort of, repository of memory sitting at the very center of the book. And we tend to think of these things as offering a guide to the past. Oh, we have this thing now. I can actually see what these clippings said, and how this global phenomenon of Muhammad Ali was experienced by this young man. And it turns out that it's actually the opposite case, that this is almost like an impediment in a sort of strange way, that it opens up memory, but it also gives us a sense about how memory is always has to be reimagined and renegotiated.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of putting it. I was just thinking when both Suneeta and Romesh were talking about the place of research in all of this, because really we're talking about the importance of forgetting in the writing process, that somehow you need to forget in order to be able to make fiction of the material of your life. And I guess I was in a strange position because I had this archive. It sounds like a very grand term. It's just really a set of scrapbooks. I had this collection of material. It felt like I had the research. And in a way, it was already processed in some imaginative way because I'd been carrying it around with me. It was already material of fiction in a funny way. And so, as you were saying, Eric, there's it appears to offer some special privileged view of the past, but actually it turns out to be such a highly shaped and biased and already transformed version of the past that it becomes a kind of obstacle to seeing what was really happening. The characters have to get past this archive in order to really see the past a little more clearly. Mm-hmm. But I was just wondering if I was wondering this when Sunita was talking, whether you were drawn to how much research you did, if any. Because it's fascinating to me that you're writing about setting a book in a country on the other side of the world, and I wondered, despite this family connection, whether you had to do a lot of research. And I was wondering that in relation to your story too, Romesh, whether you were tempted to research when one confronts the gaps in memory and the kind of holes in the story, were you tempted to fill them with a bit of research or not?
Yeah.
Sunita first, perhaps.
Yeah. I, of course, did a lot of research, and in fact, it all began pre-Google. And I did have some anecdotal access because of this auntie of mine who had lived there and gave me generously, some resources that she still had. But I did a lot of historical research at the time about the independence, the history of the independence movement, and in fact, this novel structure, like the episodic structure, then became located around some axiomatic moments, in the historical record. Mm-hmm. But then it's a really interesting thing how you, especially with a consciousness of a child, how you bring that raw material of the research to bear on. So I set up the father in my novella is, as Eric said, a kind of colonial sympathizer. He's an administrator, labor lawyer for the government, and there's a suggestion that he's also working for the secret police, the PID, but it's just alluded to. And so at different times I brought that historical research to bear in things like, obviously we do it with characterization, so attributing that profession to him and then finding out about the PID and how it would have worked. But it was a very delicate balance, because the consciousness of the child in my book is, she goes from being, when I read, she's like 3 at that point, we think it's 1963. So it really, she's born in sort of 15. Yeah, so it was really hard to be measuring constantly the historical. Once you've set up that historical structure, as you probably know, Ivan, you've got to be quite obedient to it while still having the that sense of the growth of the fictional world and the narrative consciousness, because she's obviously evolving in consciousness as well. It's not like a narrator who's 30 years old and
So I was kind of having to meet that challenge at the same time as finding which kinds of historical incident were necessary to create the frame of the fragmentation of Angolan society that, you know, before the independence. And it had, you know, there were all sorts of other things that came to bear, like Maria's friends have, Maria has some white friends, white Portuguese friends, and their, you know, uncles have farms in South Africa, and they're getting quick passage to South Africa at that time, and other things going on, you know. So her reality is, I had to kind of think about the coincidence of other geopolitical things going on at that time. So that was one aspect of the research as well. Yeah. I think that's all I should say.
Yeah, I think the research element is really interesting. And Ivan, I think it's interesting you had your archive, as it were, or scrapbooks there for you. And Sunita, you had people to ask. I think in my case, yeah, I think I did quite a lot, but quite often I find that when you're writing a book, sometimes the research does sort of come to you, comes charging towards you sometimes, it seems. And in this case, I think the one that came charging towards me was the politics, really. I could have set the novel set mainly over about 6 months in 1964. And that was a kind of zeroing in on that moment. It could have been 1967, it could have been 1963, any of those. But when I did start reading about the period to try and remind myself of what was going on, 1964 became an incredibly important watershed moment in the country politically, particularly for the political left. And I had to do a lot of research, as you can imagine. Left-wing movements anywhere in the world are incredibly complicated to get your head around, even if you were born into it. So I had to learn quite a lot about it. But then, you know, amazingly, I came across a book, for example, that was a young socialist publication, which was one of Trotsky's small little books published in Russia originally, but republished in 1962 in Colombo by the Young Socialist publication, about 2 streets away from where my character Cairo lived. And I actually found the book, and it became hugely important for the novel. But aside from the politics, I mean, I do tend to try and immerse myself in the period. So I was living through those 6 months while I was writing the book. And, you know, surprisingly, those 6 months are not very different from the 6 months when I was writing the book in 15, 16, 17, 18, and so on. Many of the same issues. Things are different today with COVID and so on, but many of the other political issues, the political shenanigans, the kind of weird entertainment that goes on in politics, all of that was there. But a couple of sources that I would normally go to, my archive used to be older people that I could rely on to tell me. But very soon after, well, actually, as I was writing this book, my mother died. So that was a major loss in terms of archive, and kind of stopped everything for a while. But also a very close friend of mine who I knew from childhood was also disappeared, as it were. And so I had to rely on imagination for a lot of things. And also, you know, when you set a book even in the, what to me seems like recent past, but for many people is, you know, historical when you talk about the 1960s, you can't go there. You know, Colombo, the city, is a totally different city. There's nothing of the same atmosphere. But I do visit Sri Lanka a lot. I did go to places. I wanted to go to places that my characters were going to, but I couldn't find them anymore. You know, they're not there anymore. But that kind of also frees you, I think, as my colleagues have said, it does free you and it does allow you to, in a sense, shape the story that needs to be shaped.
Yeah. I think that's so interesting what you're saying about what we think of as the recent past, and it doesn't. It seems like the historical past, probably to certainly to younger readers. I was thinking about that, about the fact that this encounter with as Ali becomes this global phenomenon, comparable probably only maybe to Pele in terms of an international celebrity or a global global. It's probably the first time you would talk about a global celebrity. That's registered in newspaper clippings, because television wasn't introduced to South Africa until 1975 or 76 or something like that, around that time. And one of the things that I really love about the way that you work with this, this archival material, is to register its material presence. I mean, really, the thing that's fascinating in the book is when you realize, and it's, I think, the son of Bronco, one of the two characters, one of the two storytellers in the book, flips the newspaper clippings over to realize that there's all this stuff on the other side that doesn't pertain to Ali, that just happens to be part of the archive, but its backside, as it were. Suneeta, you mentioned you were doing your research pre-Google. I don't know what the backside of Google information looks like, but that's so fascinating about that. And all three of you managed to really bring in this material sense about what it means to grapple with this moment that recent past, historical past, childhood, which I think is just really remarkable about all three of the experiences, the experiences I have in reading all three of your books.
Yeah, I think in some ways we're lucky to have a past that is sort of contained and a little bit more stable than the present that we live in. I think it is such an interesting comparison between the sort of stability of a newspaper versus the constant transformation and morphing of digital information. To get a grip on it is so difficult. When you say what's on the other side of Google, I think I don't really even want to know. I don't even want to think about it. And it's something that I became so aware of in doing a bit of research, or being tempted to do a bit of research, that extended beyond my very limited and partial, fragmented news clipping archive. In fact, it very quickly became impossible to manage. If one turned to the online sources, there's so much information about Muhammad Ali online, and there's so much information about everyone who ever came within 5 yards of him, that you very soon get completely overwhelmed. And I think for me it was a kind of lesson in the virtues of working with a smaller lens, or working with a smaller resource base, what that makes possible, and how quickly you can just disappear into the endless excess of information that we deal with now.
Yeah. I think that's a question too about this that's come up over and over, this sort of limits of or how research, in a strange way, almost has a kind of Heisenbergian relationship to the writing, over researching, especially when you're telling such incredibly important stories about the recent past. It's not that, I hate to say that it's in danger of being forgotten, but it's being transformed in a way that the work of the writer is very much to engage with that sense of how our own sense of the past changes as well.
But I think it does change. I mean, I think it was Orwell who said, people who control the present are the ones who can control the past, and those who can control the past will control the future. And this idea of rewriting history or restricting the access to it, I think is a hugely political issue, and it's happening all the time. And in a sense, that last book I was writing, Noontide Toll, about the end of the war, was set at a time when really there was a competition going on as to as to what the past was, and an erasure of certain elements to suggest that the past was different from what it was. And you can see the sort of diabolical side of that when you put it in those terms, though of course as writers we are all also manipulating the past for our own ends as well. So it seems to me it's a very kind of powerful area, and that we have to be engaged with, but I'm not sure how we do it most of the time.
Well, I think it's very interestingly done in all three cases, and very much. It's funny that you mentioned Orwell there, because I had jotted down a quote I saw last night. What can the England of 1940 have in common with the England of 1840? He writes in England, My England. But then what can you have in common with the child of 5 whose photograph your mother keeps on the mantelpiece? Nothing, except that you happen to be the same person. So, I think that we are about out of time. So I want to thank you, Romesh, Yvonne, and Sunita. Everyone, please remember you can order books in the link below. And please consider making a donation to the Brooklyn Book Festival, which is celebrating its 15th year of presenting free literary program. And thank you so much to all our panelists, and have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.